Luke Coleman paced the hardwood floor of his ranch house kitchen. His 3-week-old daughter, Ava, is screaming in his arms at 3 in the morning. The sound cut through him like a knife, reminding him of everything he'd lost. Sophie should be here. Sophie would know what to do. But Sophie was buried on the hill behind the house, and Luke was alone with a baby who seemed to cry no matter what he tried. "Please, Ava," he whispered, bouncing her gently as he'd seen Sophie do with their neighbor's children. "Daddy doesn't know what you need." His voice cracked with exhaustion. He hadn't slept more than 2 hours at a time since bringing Ava home from Doc Miller's place. The housekeeper he'd hired lasted exactly 1 day before declaring the baby too fussy and him too particular. Now, it was just him and Ava, and he was failing her. The baby's cries grew louder, more desperate. Luke felt panic rising in his chest. What if something was wrong? What if he was doing everything completely backward? Sophie had read every book about babies she could get her hands on. Luke had been focused on expanding the cattle herd and fixing the barn roof. Now he wished he'd paid attention when she tried to share what she'd learned. A soft knock at the kitchen door made him freeze. Who would come calling at this hour? Luke moved to the window. Ava is still wailing against his shoulder. Through the glass, he could see a small, elderly woman standing on his porch. She wore a simple gray dress and carried a worn leather bag. Her white hair was pinned neatly under a dark bonnet, and she stood with the confident posture of someone who belonged exactly where she was. Luke opened the door cautiously, keeping Ava close. "Ma'am, it's mighty late for visiting. Is everything all right?" The woman looked directly into his eyes with a gaze that seemed to see straight through to his soul. "Luke Coleman," she said in a voice both gentle and firm, "you need a wife." The words hit him like a physical blow. Luke stepped backward, his mouth falling open. "I beg your pardon?" "That baby needs a mother, and you need help," the woman continued, stepping past him into the kitchen without invitation. "I'm Nora Hartwell, and I knew you're Sophie." Ava's cries immediately softened to whimpers as the stranger moved closer. Luke stared at the woman in confusion and growing irritation. "I don't know who you are, but you can't just walk into my house and tell me what I need. My wife died 3 weeks ago. I'm not looking for anyone else." Nora Hartwell moved with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being listened to. She set her bag on the kitchen table and turned to face him fully. "Sophie asked me to come if anything happened to her. She was worried about you trying to raise Ava alone." "That's impossible." Luke's voice was sharper than he intended. "Sophie never mentioned you. I would remember. Your wife was a smart woman who loved you very much." Nora's expression softened. She also knew you well enough to understand you'd refuse help out of pride. "She made me promise to wait until you were desperate enough to listen." Ava had stopped crying entirely now, which was more shocking than anything the strange woman had said. Luke looked down at his daughter, who was staring with wide eyes at Nora Hartwell. In 3 weeks, no one had been able to calm Ava like this. Even Luke struggled to soothe her cries. "How did you do that?" he asked quietly. "Babies know when someone understands them," Nora replied. "Just like adults do." She moved closer, and Ava reached out a tiny fist toward her. "May I?" Luke found himself handing over his daughter without really deciding to do so. Nora took Ava with practiced ease, cradling her in a way that made the baby settle completely. For the first time in weeks, the house was truly quiet. "Sophie told me you were stubborn," Nora said, rocking Ava gently. "She also said you were the best man she'd ever known and that you'd be a wonderful father once you stopped being so scared." Tears Luke had been holding back for weeks suddenly threatened to spill over. "I don't know what I'm doing. She cries all the time, and I can't figure out what she needs. What if I'm already failing her?" "Every new parent feels that way," Nora assured him. "But you don't have to do this alone. There's a woman who needs a family as much as you need help with Ava. Her name is Rebecca Torres, and she's exactly what both of you need." Luke shook his head firmly. "I appreciate whatever arrangement you think Sophie made, but I can't just marry some stranger. It wouldn't be fair to her or to me." "Love doesn't work on your timeline, Luke Coleman," Nora said with a knowing smile. Sometimes it comes when you least expect it and most need it. Sophie knew that. Ava made a soft cooing sound in Nora's arms, the first peaceful sound Luke had heard from his daughter since bringing her home. The sight of his baby girl, content and calm, made something tight in his chest begin to loosen. "Tell me about her," he heard himself saying. "Rebecca is 28 years old and teaches school in Denver. She lost her fiancé in a railroad accident 2 years ago and moved away to start over. She's good with children, patient, and strong enough to handle ranch life." Nora shifted Ava to one arm and reached into her bag with the other. "She's also lonely and looking for purpose beyond just surviving each day." She pulled out a small photograph and placed it on the kitchen table. Luke found himself moving closer to look. The woman in the picture had kind eyes and a gentle smile. Her dark hair was pinned back simply, and she wore a white blouse that suggested she was indeed a teacher or another respectable profession. "She's pretty," he admitted reluctantly. "Beauty fades," Nora said pragmatically. "Kindness lasts forever. Rebecca Torres has both. But more importantly, she has a heart big enough to love a man's child as her own." Luke reached for the photograph, studying the woman's face more carefully. There was something in her expression that reminded him of Sophie, not in appearance, but in the warmth that seemed to shine through her eyes. "Even if I wanted to meet her, which I'm not saying I do, how would I go about it? I can't exactly travel to Denver with a 3-week-old baby." Nora smiled, as if she'd been waiting for exactly that question. "Rebecca will be at Miller's Creek tomorrow at noon. She's coming here to meet you." She handed Ava back to Luke, who was amazed when his daughter remained calm in his arms. "She's as nervous about this as you are, but she's willing to try if you are." "You already arranged this?" Luke felt a surge of irritation mixed with something that might have been relief. "What if I said no? Then she'll enjoy a nice picnic by the creek and take the evening train back to Denver," Nora replied matter-of-factly. "But you won't say no, because you're not a fool and that baby needs more than you can give her alone." Ava chose that moment to let out a small, contented sigh and close her eyes. Luke stared down at his daughter in amazement. She looked peaceful for the first time since Sophie's death. "I don't understand any of this," he said quietly. "You don't have to understand it," Nora replied, gathering her bag. "You just have to show up. Sometimes the best things in life come when we stop fighting so hard to control everything." She moved toward the door, then paused and looked back at him. "Luke, Sophie loved you enough to make sure you and Ava will be taken care of. Don't let pride rob you of the gift she's trying to give you." Before he could respond, Nora Hartwell was gone, leaving only the photograph on his kitchen table and the lingering scent of lavender in the air. Luke stood in his quiet kitchen, holding his sleeping daughter, and for the first time in 3 weeks felt something other than overwhelming despair. He picked up the photograph and studied Rebecca Torres's face again. Tomorrow at noon at Miller's Creek. What did he have to lose except his loneliness? Luke arrived at Miller's Creek 15 minutes early, Ava sleeping peacefully in the wooden carrier he'd strapped to his chest. The morning had been surprisingly calm. Ava had taken her bottle without fussing and even dozed while he shaved and put on his best shirt. It was as if Nora Hartwell's visit had changed something fundamental in his household. The creek bubbled gently over smooth stones, creating the kind of peaceful sound that had always drawn Sophie to this spot. She used to bring picnic lunches here during their courtship, spreading her grandmother's quilt under the old oak tree. Luke tried not to think about those memories as he settled on a fallen log to wait. At exactly noon, he heard the sound of a horse and buggy approaching. Luke's stomach tightened with nervousness he hadn't felt since he was 16 and asking Sophie to the church social. Ava stirred in her carrier, making soft baby sounds that no longer filled him with panic. The buggy came into view, driven by a woman in a simple blue dress and matching bonnet. Even from a distance, Luke could see this was Rebecca Torres from the photograph. She was prettier in person, with an upright posture that spoke of confidence despite what must be an awkward situation for her too. Rebecca brought the buggy to a stop near the creek bank and sat for a moment, clearly gathering her courage. Luke stood up, unsure whether he should approach or wait for her to make the first move. The decision was made for him when Ava began to fuss, drawing Rebecca's attention immediately. "Mr. Coleman?" Rebecca climbed down from the buggy with practiced ease, smoothing her skirts. Her voice was warm with a slight accent that suggested she hadn't always lived in Colorado. "Yes, ma'am. You must be Miss Torres." Luke felt suddenly tongue-tied. What did you say to a woman who'd traveled 2 days to meet a widowed stranger because a mysterious matchmaker thought you'd suit each other? "I am." Rebecca moved closer, her eyes drawn to Ava. "And this must be your daughter. Nora told me she was beautiful, but she didn't do her justice." Ava had stopped fussing and was staring at Rebecca with the same wide-eyed attention she'd given Nora the night before. Luke found this encouraging, even as he struggled with what to say next. "I have to admit, Miss Torres, I'm not sure how any of this is supposed to work. I've never been in a situation like this before." Rebecca smiled, and Luke was struck by how the expression transformed her entire face. "Neither have I, Mr. Coleman. But Nora Hartwell can be very persuasive. She showed up at my boarding house 3 days ago and told me there was a man in Cedar Valley who needed exactly what I could offer." "And what did she say you could offer?" The question came out more bluntly than Luke intended, but Rebecca didn't seem offended. "A mother for your daughter and a partner for the work of running a ranch and raising a family." Rebecca's directness matched his own. "She also said you were a good man who'd been dealt a hard blow and deserved a chance at happiness again." Ava began to make hungry sounds, and Luke felt the familiar rising panic. He'd brought a bottle, but Ava had been refusing to take it from him lately, leading to hours of crying that exhausted them both. "She's probably hungry," he said helplessly, "but she's been difficult about feeding since." He couldn't finish the sentence. "May I try?" Rebecca asked gently. "I help care for my younger siblings, and I've worked with many children at school." Luke hesitated only a moment before lifting Ava from her carrier. As soon as Rebecca took her, the baby settled in a way that made Luke's throat tight with emotion. Rebecca cradled Ava naturally, supporting her head with the instinct of someone who truly understood infants. "Hello, sweet girl," Rebecca murmured, settling on the fallen log where Luke had been sitting. "Your papa brought you a bottle, didn't he?" Luke handed over the bottle, expecting the usual struggle. Instead, Ava took it eagerly, her tiny hands reaching up to grasp Rebecca's finger. The sight of his daughter feeding peacefully in another woman's arms should have made him sad, but instead he felt overwhelming relief. "She likes you," he said, sitting beside Rebecca on the log. "Children usually do. I think it's because I remember what it felt like to be small and need someone to understand you." Rebecca looked up at him. "Nora told me about your wife. I'm very sorry for your loss." "Thank you." Luke studied Rebecca's profile as she focused on Ava. "She also told me you'd lost someone. My fiancé, Thomas. 2 years ago." Rebecca's voice remained steady, but Luke caught the slight tightening around her eyes. "A bridge collapsed while his train was crossing. 12 people died that day. I'm sorry. That must have been terrible." "It was. But grief has a way of teaching you what really matters." Rebecca shifted Ava to her shoulder for burping. The movement so natural, it seemed she'd been caring for his daughter all her life. "I spent the first year after Thomas died just trying to get through each day. The second year, I realized I was still just surviving, not really living." Ava let out a satisfied burp, making both adults smile. The baby seemed completely content in Rebecca's arms, more relaxed than Luke had seen her since bringing her home. "Is that why you came here? To start living again?" "Partly." Rebecca met his eyes directly, "but also because Nora made me realize I was waiting for my old life to somehow come back. Thomas and I had planned to have children, to build something together. When he died, I thought that dream died too. And now I'm wondering if maybe dreams don't die. Maybe they just change shape." Rebecca looked down at Ava, who had fallen asleep against her shoulder. This wasn't the life I planned, but it might be the life I need. Luke felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of the tight grief that had held him prisoner for weeks. I keep feeling guilty about even considering this, like I'm betraying Sophie's memory. Were you faithful to your wife while she was alive? The question surprised him. Of course. Did you love her completely? Yes. Then you've already honored her memory in the way that matters most. Rebecca's voice was gentle but firm. Love isn't a finite resource, Mr. Coleman. The love you had for your wife doesn't disappear just because you might love someone else someday. Ava stirred in her sleep, and Rebecca began rocking gently without even seeming to think about it. The natural way she cared for his daughter made Luke's decision easier than he'd expected it to be. Would you? He cleared his throat and tried again. Ava's been having trouble sleeping, and I haven't been able to manage the household and care for her properly. Would you consider staying at the ranch for a few days? Just until we see if this arrangement might work for both of us. Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the creek. I would need my own room, of course. And we should be clear that we're both free to change our minds without hard feelings. Of course, I wouldn't expect anything else. Then yes, I'll stay. I brought my things in case you asked. Rebecca smiled. Nora was very confident about how this meeting would go. Luke laughed, the first genuine laugh he'd had in weeks. That woman seems to know things the rest of us don't. She does indeed. Rebecca stood up, still holding Ava. Should we head back to your ranch? I'd like to see where this little one lives. As they packed up the buggy and prepared to leave Miller's Creek, Luke felt something he'd thought was gone forever. Hope. Maybe Nora Hartwell was right. Maybe he didn't have to do this alone. Rebecca had been at the Coleman Ranch for 3 days, and Luke was beginning to understand what peace felt like again. Ava slept through the night in her cradle next to Rebecca's guest room, waking only once for feeding. The house smelled like fresh bread and coffee instead of desperation and baby formula gone wrong. She's gotten so much calmer, Luke said, watching Rebecca change Ava's diaper with practiced efficiency. It was early morning, and sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, making everything feel hopeful. Baby sensed tension, Rebecca replied, fastening the clean diaper. When you're less worried, she's less fussy. It's a cycle. Luke poured coffee for both of them, noting how natural it felt to have someone to share morning routines with. Rebecca had settled into ranch life easier than he'd expected. She helped with Ava, cooked meals that actually tasted good, and even mended the curtains Sophie had left unfinished. I never thanked you properly for staying, he said, setting her coffee cup within reach. You don't need to thank me. This arrangement helps us both. Rebecca lifted Ava to her shoulder, patting her back gently. But Luke caught something in her voice, a warmth that suggested this was becoming more than just a practical arrangement. The moment was interrupted by heavy footsteps on the front porch. Luke frowned, not expecting visitors this early. The knock that followed was sharp and demanding. Luke Coleman, open this door. Rebecca looked at him with raised eyebrows. Luke's stomach dropped as he recognized the voice. That's my brother-in-law, Robert Morrison, Sophie's brother. Luke opened the door to find Robert standing there with his hat in his hands and anger written across his face. Behind him stood his wife, Margaret, looking just as disapproving. Robert, Margaret, what brings you out here so early? We heard you've got a woman living in Sophie's house, Robert said without preamble, pushing past Luke into the kitchen. His eyes went immediately to Rebecca, who was still holding Ava. Not even a month since my sister died, and you've already replaced her. That's not what this is, Luke said firmly, but Robert wasn't listening. You think Sophie would want some stranger raising her daughter? Ava should be with family, not with whatever woman you picked up. Rebecca stepped forward, her voice calm but strong. I'm Rebecca Torres. I'm here helping care for Ava because your brother-in-law needed assistance. I know exactly who you are and why you're here. Margaret spoke for the first time, her tone cold. Robert and I have been talking. A man who brings a strange woman into his home 3 weeks after his wife dies isn't fit to raise a child. Luke felt his temper rising. You have no right to come into my home and make accusations. I have every right. Ava is my niece, and if you can't properly care for her without shacking up with the first woman who comes along, then maybe she belongs with us. Rebecca moved protectively closer to Ava, and Luke saw red. You will not threaten to take my daughter. It's not a threat, Luke. It's a promise. Robert's voice was hard. I've already spoken to Judge Patterson about getting custody. A decent man waits a proper mourning period before entertaining female company. The room fell silent except for Ava's soft breathing. Luke looked at Rebecca, who had gone pale but still held his daughter protectively. In that moment, he realized this wasn't just about Ava anymore. These people were attacking Rebecca too, and he wouldn't stand for it. Get out of my house, Luke said quietly. This isn't over, Robert warned. I'll be back with legal papers. After they left, Rebecca sank into a kitchen chair, still holding Ava. Luke, I should leave. I don't want to cause problems for you and Ava. No. Luke's response was immediate and firm. They don't get to dictate how I raise my daughter or who helps me do it. Rebecca looked up at him with something that might have been relief. Are you sure? Luke sat beside her, looking at Rebecca, holding his daughter like she belonged exactly where she was. I'm sure. We'll face whatever comes together. Ava chose that moment to smile her first real smile, looking directly at Rebecca. Both adults laughed, and Luke realized Robert Morrison might have just given him the push he needed to stop fighting what was happening between them. 2 weeks had passed since Robert's threat, and Luke found himself watching the road every morning for a sheriff with legal papers. Rebecca had insisted on staying despite the complications her presence caused. Ava needs consistency, she'd said firmly. I won't abandon her because her uncle is unreasonable. The waiting had brought them closer together in ways Luke hadn't expected. They worked as a team now, sharing Ava's care and the ranch duties with an ease that felt like they'd been partners for years instead of weeks. Rebecca had even started teaching some of the local children in the afternoons, turning Sophie's old sewing room into a makeshift schoolhouse. You're good with them, Luke said, watching through the window as Rebecca helped 7-year-old Mary Peterson with her letters while Ava napped in a basket nearby. Children are honest about what they need, Rebecca replied, joining him at the window after dismissing her students for the day. Adults spend so much time pretending they don't need anything. Luke turned to look at her, struck by how naturally she'd become part of his life. What do you need, Rebecca? The question hung between them, more intimate than either had intended. Rebecca's cheeks flushed slightly, but she held his gaze. I need to feel like I matter to someone again, like I'm building something worthwhile instead of just passing time. You matter, Luke said quietly. To Ava, to those children you teach, to me. Before Rebecca could respond, Ava woke with a soft cry that sent Rebecca immediately to the basket. But Luke saw the way her hands trembled slightly as she lifted his daughter, and he knew his words had affected her as much as they'd surprised him. That evening, after Ava was settled for the night, Luke found Rebecca on the front porch watching the sunset. Without really deciding to do it, he sat beside her on the porch swing Sophie had loved. Nora Hartwell came by while you were in town today, Rebecca said. What did she want? To check on us. She seemed pleased with how things were going. Rebecca hesitated. She also warned me that Robert Morrison has been talking to people in town, trying to build a case against you. Luke felt his jaw tighten. What kind of case? He's telling people you're living in sin with a woman you barely know. That Ava needs a stable, God-fearing home. Rebecca's voice was careful, neutral. Nora thinks he might have enough support to cause real trouble. And what do you think? Rebecca was quiet for a long moment. I think maybe we should get married. The words fell between them like stones dropped in still water. Luke turned to stare at her, his heart suddenly racing. For appearances, Rebecca added quickly, to protect Ava and stop Robert's complaints. It would be a practical arrangement, nothing more. But even as she said it, Luke could see in her eyes that it wouldn't be nothing more. Not for either of them. The past 2 weeks had shown them both how well they fit together, how naturally their lives had intertwined. Rebecca, he said carefully, if we did that, it wouldn't stay practical for long. I know. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Luke reached for her hand, and she didn't pull away. I care about you. More than I expected to. More than I thought I could again. I care about you too. About both of you. Rebecca's fingers tightened around his. But what if we're wrong? What if this is just two lonely people convincing themselves they've found something real? Before Luke could answer, the sound of an approaching horse made them both look up. A rider was coming fast up the ranch road, and Luke's stomach dropped when he recognized the sheriff's badge glinting in the last rays of sunlight. Mr. Coleman? Sheriff Williams dismounted and approached the porch with obvious reluctance. I'm sorry to bother you this late, but I've got papers here from Judge Patterson. Robert Morrison has filed for custody of your daughter. Luke stood up slowly, Rebecca rising beside him. On what grounds? Moral unfitness and inability to provide proper care. The sheriff handed over the official documents. Says here you're cohabiting with an unmarried woman and creating an unsuitable environment for a child. Rebecca stepped forward, her chin raised defiantly. Sheriff Williams, I've been helping care for Ava because Mr. Coleman needed assistance after his wife's tragic death. There's nothing improper about it. I believe you, Miss Torres, but the law sees it differently. Judge wants to see you both in court next Friday. Sheriff Williams looked genuinely sorry. I'd suggest you find yourself a lawyer, Luke. After the sheriff left, Luke and Rebecca stood on the porch holding the custody papers. Ava's future hung in the balance, and they both knew what had to be done. Marry me, Luke said, turning to face Rebecca fully. Not just for appearances or to stop Robert. Marry me because I'm falling in love with you, and I think you might be falling in love with me too. Rebecca looked into his eyes, and Luke saw his own feelings reflected there. Yes, she whispered. But even as they kissed for the first time, both wondered if it was already too late to save Ava from her uncle's legal challenge. Luke and Rebecca were married 3 days later in a simple ceremony at the local church, with only Pastor Williams and his wife as witnesses. Ava slept peacefully in Rebecca's arms throughout the brief service, as if she understood that this union would keep their family together. But their happiness was short-lived. The morning after the wedding, Nora Hartwell appeared at their kitchen door once again, her expression more serious than Luke had ever seen it. We need to talk, she said without preamble, settling herself at the kitchen table. All three of us. Luke poured coffee while Rebecca bounced Ava, who had been fussy all morning. Something in Nora's tone made both of them nervous. Robert Morrison came to see me yesterday, Nora began. He's angrier than ever about your marriage. Claims it proves you're both morally corrupt, marrying so quickly for improper reasons. Let him talk, Luke said firmly. We're legally married now. He has no grounds for his custody claim. I'm afraid he does. Nora's voice was gentle but firm. A hasty marriage to a stranger doesn't look good to a judge, especially when that judge is Robert's fishing partner. Rebecca went pale. What are you saying? I'm saying you need more than a marriage certificate to win this case. You need the whole truth. Nora looked directly at Luke, including the truth about who I really am and why Sophie asked me to help you. Luke felt his stomach drop. What truth? Nora reached into her worn leather bag and pulled out an envelope, yellowed with age. Sophie wrote this letter 6 months before Ava was born. She gave it to me with instructions to deliver it only if you seemed ready to move forward with Rebecca. I don't understand, Rebecca said quietly. Sophie was my granddaughter. The words fell into the kitchen like stones. Her mother, my daughter Elizabeth, died when Sophie was young. Sophie came to live with me until she was 16 and met you, Luke. Luke stared at the old woman in shock. But Sophie never mentioned. Because I asked her not to, I had my reasons for staying away from family ties. Nora handed him the letter. But when Sophie knew she might not survive childbirth, she came to me. She was terrified of leaving you alone with a baby, knowing how stubborn and proud you are. With shaking hands, Luke opened the envelope. Sophie's familiar handwriting filled 2 pages, and he had to clear his throat before he could read aloud. My dearest Luke, if you're reading this, then I'm gone and Grandmama Nora has found you the woman I picked to love you and Ava after me. Rebecca gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Luke continued reading, his voice growing stronger. I know you'll fight this, darling, but please listen. I've been watching Rebecca Torres at church and around town for months. She has the kindest heart and the gentlest way with children. She lost her own chance at family when Thomas died, and she needs you both as much as you need her. Tears were flowing freely down Rebecca's face now. Sophie chose me before we ever met. The letter gets more specific, Nora said softly. Keep reading, Luke. Rebecca doesn't know I've been watching her, but I've seen how she lights up around babies and how patient she is with difficult children. I've seen her crying in church when Pastor Williams talks about God's plan for families. She's the woman I would choose to be Ava's mother if I could pick anyone in the world. Luke's voice broke slightly on the next part. I'm not asking you to love her the way you loved me, Luke. I'm asking you to love her the way she deserves to be loved, completely and without holding back. Ava needs a mother who will love her fiercely, and you need a partner who will love you both enough to make you whole again. Rebecca was crying openly now, still holding Ava close. She planned all of this? Every detail, Nora confirmed. She even suggested I approach you at Miller's Creek, knowing it was where you and Luke courted. She thought it would be poetic justice, she called it. Luke set down the letter, overwhelmed. Why didn't you tell us this from the beginning? Because Sophie was wise enough to know that love can't be forced, only encouraged. If you two were going to fall in love, it had to be real, not because you felt obligated to fulfill a dead woman's wishes. Rebecca wiped her tears and looked at Luke. Do you feel like we've been manipulated? Luke thought about the past weeks, about how naturally they'd grown to care for each other, about how right it felt to have Rebecca in his home and in his life. No, I feel like Sophie knew us both better than we knew ourselves. The question now, Nora said practically, is whether this letter helps your case in court. Judge Patterson respected Sophie. If he understands that this wasn't a hasty decision, but part of her dying wishes, will you testify? Luke asked. I'll do more than that. Nora stood up with renewed energy. I'll bring half the town to court to speak about Sophie's character and her love for both of you. Robert Morrison picked the wrong fight. As if sensing the shift in mood, Ava stopped fussing and looked up at Rebecca with bright, curious eyes. Rebecca smiled down at her, no longer questioning whether she belonged in this family. Thank you, Sophie, Rebecca whispered, for seeing what I couldn't see myself. The courthouse was packed on Friday morning. Luke hadn't expected so many people to show up for a custody hearing, but word had spread through Cedar Valley like wildfire. Half the town seemed to be there, filling the wooden benches and spilling out into the hallway. Robert Morrison sat at the front with his lawyer, looking confident and well-dressed. His wife Margaret sat rigidly beside him, her disapproving gaze fixed on Rebecca. But Luke noticed Robert's confidence wavering as more and more townspeople filed into the courtroom. Judge Patterson called the hearing to order, his gray beard and stern expression making him look every bit the intimidating figure Luke had feared. We're here to determine the custody of Ava Coleman, currently in the care of her father, Luke Coleman, and his new wife, Rebecca Coleman. Robert's lawyer stood up first. Your Honor, we believe Mr. Coleman has shown poor judgment and moral character by bringing an unknown woman into his home mere weeks after his wife's death, then marrying her hastily to avoid scrutiny. This creates an unstable environment for a young child. Luke's attorney, a young man named David Pierce, whom Nora had recommended, countered immediately. Your Honor, we have evidence that this marriage was not hasty or inappropriate, but rather the fulfillment of the late Sophie Coleman's explicit wishes. He presented Sophie's letter, which Judge Patterson read carefully, his bushy eyebrows rising as he took in the contents. This is quite unusual. Mrs. Coleman actually selected Miss Torres before her death. She did, Your Honor. And we have witnesses who can testify to Sophie Coleman's character, her wisdom, and her love for her family. What followed was unlike anything Luke had ever experienced. One by one, members of the community stood to speak about Sophie. Pastor Williams testified about her faith and devotion to family. Dr. Miller spoke about her courage during pregnancy, knowing the risks she faced. The schoolteacher talked about Sophie's volunteer work with children. Then Mrs. Henderson, the mercantile owner, stood up. Your Honor, I watched Sophie Coleman observe Rebecca Torres for months. She would come into my store and ask about Miss Torres's character, her kindness to children, her strength after losing her fiancé. Sophie was as careful choosing Ava's future mother as any woman has ever been. Luke felt Rebecca's hand tighten in his as testimony after testimony painted a picture of Sophie's deliberate, loving plan for her family's future. But the most powerful moment came when Nora Hartwell took the stand. She carried herself with quiet dignity as she swore to tell the truth. Your Honor, I am Nora Hartwell, and Sophie Coleman was my granddaughter, the finest woman I ever knew and the wisest. Her voice carried clearly through the packed courtroom. Sophie came to me 6 months before Ava's birth, terrified that she might not survive to raise her child. She asked me to watch over Luke and find him a wife who would love Ava as her own. And you chose Mrs. Rebecca Coleman? No, Your Honor. Sophie chose her. I merely introduced them. Nora's eyes found Rebecca in the crowd. Sophie spent months observing Rebecca Torres. She saw her kindness, her natural way with children, her strength in the face of loss. Sophie told me, that woman has the heart of a mother and the soul of a fighter. She's exactly what Luke and Ava will need. Judge Patterson leaned forward. And in your opinion, was Sophie Coleman's judgment sound? Your Honor, in 5 weeks, Rebecca Coleman has transformed that household. Ava sleeps through the night, laughs during the day, and thrives under her care. Luke has found peace and purpose again. Sophie couldn't have chosen better if she'd had years to decide. Robert's lawyer tried to object, but Judge Patterson waved him off. I've heard enough testimony to understand the character of all parties involved. The judge was quiet for a long moment, studying the papers before him. Finally, he looked up at Robert Morrison. Mr. Morrison, I understand your concern for your niece. However, the evidence shows that Ava Coleman is thriving in her current home, under the care of parents who were brought together by her late mother's wisdom and love. Robert's face grew red. Your Honor, they barely know each other. How can that be what's best for Ava? Because Judge Patterson said firmly, they know enough. Mr. Coleman is a respected rancher and devoted father. Mrs. Coleman has proven herself to be a loving caretaker and positive influence on both father and child. Most importantly, this arrangement fulfills the clearly expressed wishes of Ava's birth mother. Luke felt his knees go weak with relief. Custody of Ava Coleman will remain with her father, Luke Coleman, and his wife, Rebecca Coleman. This case is dismissed. The courtroom erupted in cheers. Luke pulled Rebecca into his arms, both of them crying as townspeople surrounded them with congratulations. Through the crowd, Luke saw Robert and Margaret Morrison leaving quickly, their lawyer shaking his head in defeat. 7 months later, Luke stood on the same front porch where he'd first kissed Rebecca, watching his wife teach a group of local children under the old oak tree. Ava, now crawling and babbling, played in a basket nearby, reaching for butterflies and laughing at everything she saw. Rebecca looked up from her students and caught Luke watching her. The smile she gave him made his heart race the same way it had that first day at Miller's Creek. Story time's over, Rebecca announced to the children. Go home and practice your letters. As the children scattered, Rebecca picked up Ava and walked to the porch. What are you thinking about, husband? about how Sophie knew exactly what we needed before we did. Luke wrapped his arms around both his girls. About how lucky we are. We have news that might make you feel even luckier, Rebecca said, her eyes sparkling with mischief. What kind of news? The kind where Ava's going to be a big sister next spring. Luke stared at her in shock, then hooped loud enough to scare the chickens. As he spun Rebecca around the porch, Ava giggling in her arms, he looked up to see Nora Hartwell approaching on the road. "I thought you might need this," she called out, holding up a minister's book. "For the baptism planning, of course." Luke and Rebecca looked at each other and burst into laughter. Some things, apparently, never changed. "Thank you, Nora," Rebecca called back. "For everything." The old woman smiled and tipped her bonnet. "Sophie would be proud of the family you've built. Both of you." She paused at the gate. "My work here is finally done." As Nora walked away, Luke held his wife and daughters close, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. Sophie had been right about everything. Love didn't replace love. It multiplied it, creating something bigger and more beautiful than any of them could have imagined alone. Ava reached up and touched Luke's face with her tiny hand, babbling something that sounded almost like Papa. Rebecca laughed and kissed them both. "Perfect," Luke whispered and meant it completely.